What we know of basically about the Zulosoi, which is very critical, is that in actuality the Zulosoi really is an organism, and this is a very powerful concept and so on. In other words, in the physical universe and in the various different planes of existence, we have a certain knowledge of each other. But the question really is, what is the natural knowledge that we have of each other? What is there to know about each other in an organism? So it's a very important thing to understand that in order to create the possibility of free will, where a person has the ability to change his mind about who he is, it affects the fundamental knowledge of his own organism, where he has a different concept of who he is and from what he is. Why is that? Why does the Rebbe Shalom interfere with the person's knowledge of himself? Because intrinsically, every Zulosoi is connected. Every Zulosoi is connected to every other Zulosoi. There's no such thing as a separation, really. There's no such thing as a true separation between every manifestation of the Zulosoi. Like we said, that's because there's no real concept of separation. It doesn't exist. And this is very important to understand. When we think of God, what is the most important idea that comes to us from God? What is the one idea that Judaism says, or the Torah says about God? So what that idea is the following: Ein od, there is no other. In other words, what the Torah is telling us, that the essence of God itself is that he's one being without another, but not that he's someone where another God does not exist, but that another God is not possible to exist. So when the Torah stresses the concept, it stresses the unity of God. It's Achdus. And what it says about his Achdus is not simply there's only one God, but it says fundamentally that there can be only one God. In other words, God has no outside. And this is a very powerful idea. This is the only thing that really the Torah says about God. You know, that God is a certain power that we have never seen before. You know, when people think that someone is very great or very big or very powerful, they think of God in this way. But God is not described as the most powerful thing or the most knowledgeable thing or the most pleasant thing of all. God is not giving an adjective as to say that he has certain qualities which are infinite or all-powerful, all-knowing. That's not the main thing, the main factor when the Torah describes God. When the Torah describes God, it's that there's nobody else. That is his power, that there is nothing else besides him. In other words, God is simply a being who has no outside. So there's no other possible being. And why is that? Why doesn't God have an outside? Because the existence of God is his exclusively. In other words, the most important concept that the Torah tells us about God is that his existence is never shared. It's not shared with anything else. and that it's a personal property of him. His existence, the fact that he is personal to God, because it's unlike anything else and gives no existence. It does not allow that existence to be shared. So his existence, the existence of God, is if I may say it, is a personal matter. And that since God is the only person as such, he's the only individual that exists. So therefore, his existence is actually totally personal to him. It's not a general thing that can be shared with anyone else. So therefore, nothing else does exist. Why? Because nothing can exist. Because existence is not a process which is attached to the essence of a thing. Existence is synonymous with the thing itself. You exist because existence belongs to you. So in a certain way, the existence of God is completely personal and cannot be shared with anything. So therefore, nothing else can exist. So the Torah stresses that what the power of God is. That the power of God is simply in the word exclusivity. Existence is exclusive to God because it is a personal property that belongs to God. And nothing else shares it. So from that unity that the Torah described to be God, everything proceeds from. So therefore, since God is the only thing which can exist, anything which is derived from him must be a single thing, without compartments, without parts. Just like he has no compartments. We say that God, the word that we use to describe God is the word pashut. He's simple. What does that mean, simple? It simply means that he has no parts. He's not composed of different elements all strung together to make one being. So when you think of God, you cannot think of different aspects of him. You cannot think of his power. You cannot think of his existence. You cannot exist of his presence, because none of these things are qualities which are outside of him. Every quality that he possesses is absolutely personal. And that's what his yichud means. His unity refers to the fact that everything in God is completely personal to him alone. And nothing exists outside of him. So therefore, not even the quality exists. So in other words, God does not have a component, it's composed of different elements. Because if he was composed of elements, each of these elements would be a separate thing. And there's nothing separate about any aspect of his being. So therefore, anything which comes from God comes from that force. It comes from that unity of what he possesses. And that's what the word pashut means. Simple. He's not composed of any idea. He's not composed of a quality that has any sense of independence. So pashtus is identical to his unity. That God's unity is so incredible that there's nothing in him which is even separate from anything else. It is the same thing. Every quality that God possesses is him. It's not a quality of him. It's not a certain factor that he has. It isn't. It's him. He is everything that he is. Nothing is outside of him, so nothing else exists as a concept or is in existence outside of him. So all of it is jumbled together and equals the same thing. Every one of his qualities is equal to himself. So God therefore is Pashut. So what does this tell me that's so important? The unity of God tells me that everything which comes from him, whether it's derived from him or whether it's created by him, has an absolute unity also. Just like he is completely unified with himself, he is himself. Anything which comes from him, was created or not, has that unity and the fact that it comes from him. So this tells us something about the Zulosai, which we find very strange. God does not make one specific Zulosai so that he made 2, 3, 4, 5 Zulosais. God did not make the Zulosai into something which is quantifiable. And the Zulosai that comes from God, that is derived from God, is an absolute also unity. That's why we say that the Zulosai is an organism. The Zulosai is not a being which is divided into different types or different parts, all jumbled together. The Zulosai is not a quality or an attribute. It cannot even be counted in a sense, but it also doesn't have a part to it. And this is very difficult to understand, that there are no parts to the Zulosai also. In other words, the Zulosai itself is pure consciousness. And in a certain sense, the Zulosai is a single consciousness. And this is very hard to understand. So when the Zulosai sees another Zulosai, in a certain sense, from a certain point, they're looking at each other because they are each other, not exactly like God. There's nothing outside of God. So therefore, everything that he is him. In a certain similar way, the same thing applies to the Zulosai. The Zulosai really represents, in a certain sense, a being where every part of that being is part of the totality of that being. We cannot have a true understanding of that concept. We cannot truly understand the unity of the Zulosai. Like you have different parts of the Zulosai, but all of these parts are fundamentally equal to the whole. And we cannot truly comprehend how something which has parts, different aspects to it, and so on, has such a total unity. And that's a certain concept which is known in Olam Haba. We cannot understand the way a Zulosai, one Zulosai, looks at another Zulosai in Olam Haba. Because it's much more than simply seeing one thing sees another thing. In a certain way, when one Zulosai is looking at another Zulosai, in a certain way, they're almost like they're looking at themselves. That's right. The unity between Zulosais in Olam Haba is almost like looking at yourself, like a mirror image. It's like you're looking at yourself in a mirror, which fundamentally looks a lot like you. But yet on a certain level, it's not you. So the question is, how does this take place? How does this unified vision of a Zulosai exist so that when the Zulosai looks at another Zulosai, it's almost as if he's looking at himself. It was make up your mind. Either you have a multiplicity of Zulosais, or you only have one Zulosai. But how could there be a multiplicity of Zulosais that are fundamentally one Zulosai? What's the nature of such a being? And that's what I'm going to try and talk about now, this concept, the concept of multiplicity. Because in Olam Hazeh, in this physical world, when we're looking at something, we're looking at a separate identity for each Zulasai. I see a Zulasai as separate from each other. So that's how I see the concept of multiplicity. That each Zulasai is different than an other Zulasai. But in Olam Haba, something happens where all the individual Zulasais that I see, when I see the total multiplicity, I'm really looking at a unity which ushered almost does a unity which actually replaces the multiplicity. So I'm going to try and give you a better concept of this, but it'll be a little difficult. What exactly do I mean by the achdus, or the unity of the Zulasai in its totality? Is the Zulasai really just an organism? And how close are the parts of the organism? In other words, what is the true nature of the relationship of one Zulasai to another? And that's why I will try and explore this in a certain way. You see, you have to remember, what's the fundamental problem that God wants to heal? What is the problem that antagonizes the yichud of the Baruch Shalom? Or the thing which antagonizes his yichud is the concept of multiplicity. God does not fit at all with the concept of multiple or multiplicity. And this is the main idea which the Torah says about God. Enoid, there's nothing else. And there's nothing else, there's no other being included with God. The only being is God himself. And there's no possibility of another being at all. Surely there's nothing outside. And anything which competes with that, any attempt to try and exist in some way as independent of God, or rather as outside of God, cannot succeed. Because his unity is such that it creates a certain pressure. It must be. God's unity is fixed. And that unity is so fixed that it cannot be altered. In other words, in a certain way, there's one thing that God cannot do, in a certain sense. But the fact that he can't do this is not a limitation on him. He can't do that because of his being is so great. God cannot create another God. Because what's the definition of a God? It's a being which is completely independent of everything, even its own existence. God has an existence which completely belongs to himself. It's not given to him by anyone else. We say that's the concept of a subject. He has his own existence. Why? Because he is his own existence. That's it. That's what he is. He is existence itself. He's a subject. God has self-awareness. But that self-awareness is so identical with his essence that his self-awareness is existence itself. Nothing can share it. And that existence produces a pressure so that there's nothing that can exist besides God at all. And therefore, that yichud, that level of yichud, produces a certain pressure which counteracts even the possibility that something else exists. So God cannot create a being that says to him, you, me, you. because that indicates multiplicity. God cannot create the concept of multiplicity. He is an absolute exception to that concept. God cannot create something which can refer to him as you, where you are outside of me. That possibility does not and cannot exist. And that's his yichud pressure. The only thing that possibly comes near that is the Zulasa itself. And this problem, where the Zulasa begins to approach on a certain level.
It's that traffic.
What's that? What? And this possibility is really what is referred to as Nam Sufa. That the Zulosai is a being who is also a subject. And he has self-awareness, and he knows that he exists by himself. So therefore, he almost fits the description of another God. But he's not another God. He's a derived from the God himself. But since he is almost like another God, and that's what it means, when David HaMelech said that the Zulosai, mankind, is slightly less than God. It means, of all things that God created, the only being that's capable of saying you on any level is a person. That's right. And that's the godless of the Zulosai. That to a certain extent, but not actually, to a certain extent, he can actually say you to God. And that's why God says to him, you have to fix that. In other words, my being will not tolerate someone saying you to me, will not tolerate a being who's outside of me. And that has to be fixed. And how do you fix that? With mitzvahs. Because mitzvahs fundamentally make you one with me. It creates the concept of love. And the reason why you love me is because you're really part of me. And when you really love something, you see that as part of you, or as you are part of it. And that's the only thing that heals that yichud pressure. And that's what creates the possibility that mankind has to do mitzvahs. He has to acknowledge that push comes to shove, that in the final analysis, you cannot say to God, you. You cannot refer to him as if you are outside of him, because you are still totally inside of him. And if you want to maintain any kind of feeling that you are outside of him, and you say to him, me, you, or you call him, you therefore are committing the greatest evil of all, because evil is nothing more than the attribution that God is a you. That's another way that I'm going to define evil. What is evil? What is Ra? Where does it come from? Well, God never made it. It doesn't come from anywhere. It comes from a completely a view that God can have an outside. And it comes from the view that possibly you are outside of God. That is pure evil. And that's a direct contradiction to the nature of God. God is not a you to anyone because there's nothing outside of him. So God never created evil as such. Evil is completely a rebellion against the concept of his unity. And therefore evil cannot exist because it is a total contradiction to God. So therefore the fundamental purpose of a being, of a Zulasai, is to get rid of that evil. How? By completely acknowledging the fact that God is not a you to him. The word you does not apply to God ever in any sense. There has to be a complete recognition of this fact. And this fact alone creates the concept of yichud pressure. And that's the real reason why you have to masakin it. You know, no one really discusses that or realizes its intensity. what it simply says in a way as a possibility is that the reason why a person has to do mitzvahs is that he earns a certain recognition from God that he exists. And then when he establishes his own existence by something he does, he then removes the disempowerment which he feels. And when he removes a certain disempowerment, he's capable of going to Olam Haba, where this disempowerment doesn't exist anymore. But that indicates simply that the Zulosai has to do something where he creates the possibility in a certain way that God is a you, because he's doing something for God. So in a certain way, he has to do mitzvahs, he has to earn the possibility where God is a you to him. But this is not true at all. Nothing can be a you to him. He cannot be a you to anybody, no matter what a person does. This disempowerment will exist forever, beyond time. It's impossible. God has to remove, the Zulosai has to remove even that thought that such a possibility exists, because it doesn't. So that's why Namik Sufa is a problem, is a pathological problem in a certain sense. It's a falsity. It's a disease that completely contradicts the true nature of God. And therefore it has to be removed. And it can only be removed when you love him. And that's only removed by doing something completely because he requested it. So it's a completely recognition that there's nothing outside of him. There's nothing that can contradict him. So in a certain way, Namik Sufa is like a medicinal problem. It's a problem in health. If you are a Zulosai and you exist because God made you, and you refer to God as a you, well, that's pathological. That's a disease that has to be removed. So the very creation of the Zulosai as a being who almost has the possibility of referring to God as a you has to be healed. It has to be cured. And that's what the whole avodah of the Torah is. God says to the Zulosai, you have to heal yourself from this disease that you think you're outside of me. And if you don't, that disease will finally end you. It will make it impossible for you to exist. So since the Zulosai is so closely connected to God and so closely connected to God's unity, what about the Zulosai itself? What about one Zulosai in its relationship to another Zulosai? Obviously, its own relation to another Zulosai must be so intense, it must be so close that there actually even barely exists the possibility that the Zulosai can say you to another Zulosai. The problem is somewhat similar to God. Just like a Zulosai cannot say you to God, a Zulosai, it's very difficult for a Zulosai to look at another Zulosai and say you to it. Although it can do it a little more, the Zulosai does not produce a yichud pressure. It doesn't have that level of yichud. You cannot say to the Zulosai, ein oid. You cannot say it. But to some extent that's true. Therefore the Zulosai also has a problem of Namik Sufa. Because the Zulosai has a certain divinity to it. And that divinity is captured by the idea of ein oid. So the Zulosai has a problem with saying you to another Zulosai. It doesn't have the same problem as that saying you to God, but to some extent it is. That's why the creation of the Zulosai is a being with also a relative unity. Just as God is completely one in an absolute way, where he has no outside, the Zulosai also is relatively also one without an outside. So technically speaking, there's no such thing as two Zulasois. That the Zulasoi exists with such a close unity with another Zulasoi that for us it's incomprehensible. But the question is, how does this work? So God had to do something which is extremely difficult. God had to apply a certain pressure between Zulasois, where one Zulasoi looks at another Zulasoi and sees someone who's completely outside of it. And he refers to this other Zulasoi as a you. Me, I am a Zulasoi, and you are a Zulasoi. And both of us are outside of each other. You see, that of course is a false view, because the two Zulasois are not really even outside of each other. Although it's very difficult for us to comprehend that. What does that mean? One Zulasoi looks at another Zulasoi and doesn't see him as outside? How is that possible? Either there's a multiplicity of Zulasoi or there's not. Well, that's the concept of an organism. The Zulasoi, all Zulasoi together, really together constitutes one organism. And therefore, every Zulasoi knows intimately every other Zulasoi. How does he know him? Well, that's what we have talked about. How does one Zulasoi know another Zulasoi if he's actually almost one with every Zulasoi there is? How does that work? But God needs to do that in order for God to heal the Zulasoi and make him realize that he is not outside of the Zulasoi, or rather the Zulasoi is really part of him. He has to also heal that from himself as he sees another Zulasoi. In a certain sense, just like the Zulasoi cannot see God as a you, in a certain sense, that's similar also to one Zulasoi to another. That each one does not truly see the other one as outside of him. I know this is a shocking concept, because here on earth we all see each other as separate. But this had to be created. This concept had to be developed. It does not occur by itself. The independence of one Zulasoi from one to the other is not a true fact. It's an only apparent fact. It looks like that's true. Here on earth, when I'm looking at another person, I'm seeing someone as a you, is outside of me. But the fact that we both come from God, we are both derived from God, both of us as Zulasois are derived from God, tells me really that in a certain way, not to the extent with God, but in a certain way, two Zulasois merge. So the concept of Pashtus applies to God in an absolute way. God is completely one being. He's not composed of any parts. There's no multiplicity in God. But in a certain sense, that also applies to the Zulasoi. So therefore, in Olam Haba, when we see another Zulasoi, I'm almost looking at myself. That's what that really is. So this concept when I look at another Zulasoi, that I'm not really looking at someone outside of me, but I'm looking at someone who's almost inside of me. That's called a superorganism. An organism is a kind of an entity which is composed of separate parts, all having the same function. The human body is an organism. It's composed of organs that do the same thing. The purpose of the organism, known as the human body, is to keep the person alive. So it has different organs for that. There's the organ of what? The brain, there's the heart, there's the liver, stomach, and so on. So even though these organs are separate from each other, but in relationship to their task, in relation to what they do, they all do the same thing, and they exist for the same purpose, to keep the person in life. That's why it's called an organism. That's why that organism knows every part of it. Every part of that organism is known by every other part of the organism. Why? Because they share the same idea of life. They all contribute to the same idea. So therefore, there's no such thing as a stranger in an organism. Every organ in the human body knows every other organ in the body, and therefore it refuses to take a transplant of an organ from another body. It rejects it because it says, I want my organism. I want my liver. I want my stomach. I want my heart. I don't want you to give me another heart, because the identity of an organ is unique to itself. But in Olam Haba, this is much more powerful. The identity of every Zulasai is specific to the whole Zulasai. There's a concept called the total Zulasai. That's the macro Zulasai, which is composed of all the Zulasais that were ever derived from God. Fundamentally, they all come together in one real super organistic being. There's something called a superorganism, and that superorganism is the macro Zulasai. And every part of him really is part of the whole. So therefore, one Zulasai looks at another Zulasai and thinks it's looking at itself. Like one Zulasai looks like almost every other Zulasai.
Do we lose Reb Shimon?
I think so.
We can call back in, I guess. Want to stop the tape?
I'm trying. For some reason, I can't seem to stop.
Hello?
Yeah, we lost you.
Hello.
Okay, I'm back.
Okay.
Somehow I got lost.
All right. Okay.
So what I'm saying, that there are different levels of organisms. That there must be an organism. The Zulasai is an organism. It's part of one entity, part of one body. But the organism of the Zulasai in Olam Haba is so unified that to almost a certain degree, every Zulasai, when it looks at another Zulasai, is almost looking at itself. That's how close. Does it look at another Zulasai completely like itself? No, because there's a slight differentiation between every Zulasai in that total organism. There's a slight difference. There's a slight level of an outside. But that level of one Zulasai being outside of another is so slight that it barely exists. So the concept of Olam Haba, the main feature of Olam Haba, is that two Zulasais almost look like each other. And therefore, all of them together, every component Zulasai looks like it's the same as a total Zulasai. We cannot comprehend this level of unity. But in order for God to give us the test of whether or not we are separate from Him, He has to make it possible that we see things as outside of us, so that we can believe that we have an outside. And if we think that we have an outside, we think that God has an outside. And that's called the Yetzer Hara. The belief that God has an outside and can be referred to as a you is false. But that is the belief of the Yetzer Hara. That is the belief which is subject to the Yichud pressure. That unless you understand that God has no outside and is not a you cannot exist. And the Zulasai has this problem. It sees God as a you. so it has to learn to love God. But fundamentally, this is totally untrue. God is not a you to anyone at any time whatsoever. But what I'm talking about, the relationship of one zulosai to another. The only difference is somewhat slightly less. When the zulosai sees, when he knows God, he sees God as an absolute, as an absolute being which has no outside. But when he looks at another zulosai, he does see somewhat a concept of outside, but it is so slight that it's almost as if he's looking at himself. But God has to alter that to allow the zulosai to masaken his problem of nam l'ksufa with each other. So therefore, God has to create a world in which zulosai see each other as totally separate. And there are different madregas of separation. And I want to describe the madrega of the separate sight of one zulosai to another. Now I want to talk about the zulosai himself. How does the zulosai know about the existence of another zulosai? How does he see another zulosai? How does that organismic relationship that he has with another zulosai manifest in the different worlds? Now we understand that what God wants to do, when God wants to test the zulosai in terms of how he sees him, God, he has to do it by manifesting him in such a way where he sees another zulosai as outside. So in other words, the way the zulosai learns of the absolute unity of God is when he observes other zulosais, and he notices a strange thing, that there's almost an absolute unity between him and another zulosai. That's how he learns that God himself has no outside. Because you cannot know God. You cannot observe him in any sense. You just know that he's outside of you. But the nature of that outside is impossible to comprehend. We cannot comprehend the yichud of the Rebbeinu Shalom. But that lesson comes to us because what we come to realize is that really we can't even comprehend, we can barely comprehend the outside aspect of the one zulosai from another. So how does God disturb, how does God disrupt this knowing of the zulosai from each other? How does he make it sound like when the zulosai sees another zulosai, he's looking at something outside of himself? How does he do that? Since the real nature of the zulosai is almost a complete unity, how does God manage to create the concept of multiplicity? So the answer to that is in what's called the ishtalshelus, that we go from one world to another. That is the essence. What is the essence of the ishtalshelus? That what? That the Ein Sof has to create what? The Rishimu, a trace of him. And then in the next world, he goes to another plane of existence called Odin Kadmoin. And then after that, he goes to another plane of existence called Atzilus. So when we look at the ishtalshelus, or the chain of one reality to another, what's really changing? What's changing is how one zulosai sees another zulosai, and therefore automatically how the zulosai sees God. You see, that's how it's done. The zulosai learns of the unity of God, that God is not a you, by seeing the unity of another zulosai, that another zulosai is barely a you to himself. So therefore when he sees another zulosai and he realizes the organismic relationship that he has with another zulosai, he begins to comprehend who God is. Because if another zulosai is barely a you, God is absolutely not a you. So he understands the yichud of the one who created him, the one who derived him. He understands his yichud because he sees the yichud between himself and all the other zulosais. So therefore he appreciates the achdus of the Rebbeinu Shalom. So the nimshul of the ishtalshelus of Elamas In the Kabbalah, you have the first olam, what's called the Ushimu, which is the highest level of Zulosai. And then the next level of the world called Adam Kadmoin, which produces the Zulosai as an object of Tikkun. And the next level is what? Is Atzilus, the world of Atzilus, which creates an interaction between Zulosais. And then finally, the Zulosai becomes an entity of the world of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asira. But the end result is that the Zulosai exists in the world called Asiya. And what is this world? This is the world where one Zulosai sees another Zulosai as completely outside of it. That's all that's changing. You have to understand that every world, as part of the Ishtalshalis, which is part of all the planes of existence that God created, are simply become darker and darker, which means that multiplicity seems to exist. As we descend in the world, as we go from the world of Adam Kadmoin to the world of Atzilus, we see a greater concept of multiplicity. And as we go from what? Well, we come from Atzilus to the world of Bria and so on, we see the idea, the concept of multiplicity becoming more and more stark. So by the time we get down to the world of Asiya, we are in a world where literally one Zulosai looks like it's completely outside of another Zulosai. The concept of organism does not exist anymore in the world of Asiya. You see, the concept of an organism on its super level, which is Olam Haba, exists to such an extent that the Zulosai is a superorganism. There's barely an outside. And on the lower worlds, this concept of barely an outside is shrinking. So the other Zulosai appears to be withdrawing from him. And to create the idea of multiplicity. So one Zulosai looks at another Zulosai in the world of Adam Kadmoin as almost connected. And he looks at another Zulosai in the world of Atzilus as almost connected, but somewhat separate. And in the world of Bria, more separate. And the world of what you see were more separate. And the world of Asiya as totally separate. So what's being developed from one world to another is a greater and greater appearance of the concept of multiplicity. And what is multiplicity? Multiplicity is the creation of the appearance of an outside. That's it. As you go from one world to another, you are creating a greater and greater concept that there's something outside of me. So what's being developed in the Ishtalshalis from one world to another, in all the worlds of Kabbalah, is simply that the concept of an outside is being aggravated until finally it reaches its peak at the world of Asiya, where literally when you're looking at another Zulosai, when one Zulosai looks at another Zulosai, he thinks that he's looking at something outside of him. So the term you becomes more and more valid. In the higher worlds of Atzilus, Adam Kadmoin, in the higher worlds, there's barely a concept of you, barely, of an outside. And finally, when you get down to the world of Asiya, which is the lowest level, you have a specific idea that there is an outside. Why? Because there's a multiplicity. There's you and there's me. You and me represent a duality. And that duality appears to be real. And since it appears to be real, we see therefore what? That the world is composed of two things. It's composed of the concept of me and the concept of reality. There's something outside of me in a plane called reality. I exist in reality. And what does that mean? There's I, and that's my consciousness, my self-awareness, exists among other conscious beings, which is called my reality. So therefore, as we go from one world to another, and down lower and lower and lower, reality begins to take on a definition. What's created from one world to another? The notion of reality. There's something outside of me. What is reality? That there is something outside of me. The essence of reality is the notion that there are at least two things in the world that exist: me and outside. Me and reality. I exist in a reality. So I am part of the multiplicity of creation. There's me, my self-awareness, in something called reality, where there are things which besides me, there are things which are outside of me. This is a very deep concept. So we see that God, when he creates the worlds, when he derives the worlds, it's called a stalculus. There's a slight noise. Could you make sure that your recording has no noise? Okay. So this is a very deep concept, because now we finally understand what a stalculus is. When you go from one world to another world to another world, and you are going down. And what does it mean you're going down to a lower world? In the lower world, you're going down because what's being created is the concept of outside, the concept of reality. Why does God want to do this? Why does he want to take the appearance of the Zolosoi as a superorganism? Whereas the Zolosoi is looking at another Zolosoi, he's actually in a certain way looking somewhat at himself. Why? Why does he want to disrupt this level of unity of the Zolosoi? Because he wants the Zolosoi to understand that when it comes to outside, God himself has no outside. At the highest level, when God exists, there is no such thing as an outside of you. And that's what God is. You cannot see God because you cannot contrast him to anything outside of him. There's nothing you can contrast him with that indicates any type of duality. So God wants you to have this comprehension as a Zolosoi by seeing your relationship with another Zolosoi. That on a certain level, you also have the same relationship to another Zolosoi. That there's barely an outside. Because just like God is an absolute unity, the Zolosoi is said to be a relative unity. There's barely an outside. There's barely a separate being. The word outside means multiplicity. When you see yourself and you realize you have an outside, something is outside of you, you are seeing a duality. A duality is the minimum amount of outside. If you see something that's outside of you, that's through your reality. So God has to bring that condition called reality or called outside to teach you that he himself has no outside. And that's the whole purpose of the Ishtalshalos. So the whole purpose of all of God's creation is to introduce to you the concept that there's you and there's something outside of you. So that you will eventually realize what? That there is nothing outside of God. He introduces the concept of outside, the concept of duality, the concept of multiplicity, so that you should understand that when it comes to him, there is no such thing as outside. And you will suddenly grasp, to whatever degree, some kind of idea of who he is, of what his yichud is. That God is not related to you in the sense that there's something slightly outside. You're slightly outside of him. No, you are not outside of him at all. It's absolute. There's no exception to it. And the only way God can bring you that concept is by creating a reality where multiplicity is through, where there is at least a duality of me and you. So he has to create the possibility of that reality where there's me and you. Why? So that you can deny that reality. And that's what happens when you love God. When you love God the way he has to be loved, it's because you recognize that God is not outside of you. And you are not outside of God in a certain way. So God has to bring you down to the lowest level of perception of reality, that there's a multiplicity in reality, so that you will reject that idea. Right, He introduces the idea of multiplicity so that you eventually will reject that idea as being untrue. Why does he want you to reject that idea? Because that idea will annihilate you. His yichud pressure is such that if you have the idea that he's outside of you and therefore he's a you cannot coexist with him. That would be coexistence. And two subjects cannot coexist. So therefore he creates something, he produces something so that he can reject it, so that he can cause you to reject that possibility. So therefore what does he do? So he doesn't change his reality. God has no outside. But what he does is he changes your reality. And what's your reality? The way you look at another Zulasai. As your view of a Zulasai changes, so will your view of him, God, change. As you realize that you're closer and closer to becoming one, you will realize that he is already at the stage of being an absolute one without a second parents, without someone else. There's no outside. So this is the fundamental irony. The fundamental irony of God's creation is to eliminate the possibility that you see him as a you. But in order to do that, he first has to create that possibility that you can see him as a you, that you see things in multiples. And when he creates that possibility, then eventually, through your commandments, the avodah of the mitzvahs, and loving God, you will then deny that possibility because God does not have an outside. And that's his pashtus. So you learn from yourself who God is. That's your Rabbi. The only way you come to understand who God is by someone understanding who you are. But that God exists in a way which is far beyond you, because God has nothing outside of him, whereas on a certain level, you still retain something outside of you, and that's another Zulasoi. That's called a superorganism. So I'm going to prove this concept, this ironic concept that God creates something to get rid of it. God creates the concept of outside so that you can get rid of the concept of outside, that you understand it does not apply to him. It only applies to you, and only subtly. And that's the unity, the achdus of the Zulosai. It's somewhat ironic, isn't it? And we see this truly, and I'll explain how we see it. When I see someone, let's say I see another person. What am I looking at? In the physical universe, what do I possess? I possess something called a sense. And a sense tells me that I can detect another person. But when I'm looking at another person, and I see what? I see, first of all, that there's something outside of me, because there's something separate from me. My vision creates the sight of another being outside of me. But does this sight give me knowledge of this person? Do I know who he is? When I see somebody walking down the street and it's another person, what do I know about him? Nothing. He's a total stranger to you. Why is he a total stranger? Because it's bizarre how you see him. And this is a very deep concept. How do you see him? What is sight? What exactly is a sense perception? The truth of it. It's the ability to develop what's called a mind photo. That's what it is. When you see someone, you're really looking at the light which bounces off this person and is reflected to you. That light enters your eye, and it settles on your retina, and your retina takes the sight and converts it into electrochemical impulses.
No GPS. I don't know why.
What's that? What is sight? In sight, you are taking the light which is reflected by another person, and that reflection of that light goes into your eyes. And your retina in your eye cells, 100 trillion 100 million cells in your retina, converts that light into an image. It takes each image that your eye sees is composed of 100 million components, all fit together, which gives you an image of that person. And where is that image put? It's put on your mind. It's put into your self-awareness. And what do you see? You see an image or like a photograph on your mind. Are you seeing that person? No. A sight is not about a person. When you see something, you are seeing nothing. What you are seeing is the image that your mind is that your eyes are creating and placing on your mind. So therefore, every sight that you have, without exception, it's like a photograph. It's a photograph. That's all you can know. The closest you can get to another person is simply that you are aware that something exists outside of you. But what is it? You'll never know. You cannot see what it is that you in your mind. You have an image in your mind, and that image looks like the person. It's called looking like. It's called a sight. But there's no such thing as a sight. A sight of another person is purely in your mind. You are never in touch with the reality of that other person. You don't even know what that reality looks like. It doesn't look like anything because sight is a photograph. When you see something, you are making a photograph of that thing in your mind. And that's simply a reflection of the light that's bouncing off him. And you are taking a photograph of that, and you are placing that photograph in your mind itself. The photograph does not exist out of your mind. A vision that you have of someone does not exist outside of your brain, which means something shocking. It means you could never come in touch with reality itself. Reality itself can only be viewed in terms of photographs. When you see something, you are making what's called, and you call it sight, you are seeing something in your mind. When you hear something, you're hearing it in your mind. When you touch something, you're developing a feeling of what the thing feels like. It's in your mind. When you touch an object that feels hard, there's no such thing as hard. Hardness is simply a feeling that your mind is giving you of what that object is. And same thing with smell and touch, with taste. So all five senses that we have allow us to detect another thing. It allows us to detect the existence of something else. What is that existence? We have no idea. All we have an idea of is that we have five senses, which tells me five different photographs of what this thing looks like in our mind. That's it. So the whole purpose of a sense, seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, smelling, a sense is nothing more than a photograph which is in my mind and which represents that thing which I'm kind of trying to figure out what it is. So we see something very powerful, that the closest we can get to another reality, to that which we see as a multiplicity, the closest we can get to that is simply an image in our mind. We cannot get closer to it. So all that our mind then, it just tells us, it detects something. When you see another person, what's really happening is your mind is saying, I detect the presence of another person through senses. Sight, hearing, smelling, touching, tasting. All of these are photographs in my mind. And that's what the detection is. So the closest we can come to anything else outside of us is simply to detect its presence. But do I know anything about it? Nothing. And that's called a stranger. What is a stranger? A stranger is simply the art of detection. I don't know it. I don't know what it is. I cannot know it. I cannot know something outside of my senses. And all my senses tell me is that this thing appears as a detection. I detect the presence of something which is in my mind. I cannot get closer to it. And that's why it's called a stranger. A stranger is something you can detect, but you cannot know. You have no knowledge of that. When you see another person, you say to yourself, I don't know this person. I don't know who he is. I don't know about him. I don't know anything about him. No, you're not saying that at all. What we're really saying is all I can do is detect the presence of something else. I have no knowledge of that something else, except the photographs that my mind are showing me about this other thing outside of me. So in the Olam Asiyah, which is the lowest world, our knowledge never succeeds in knowing something. It only succeeds in detecting the presence of something. That's the whole Olam Asiyah. And that's the concept of a stranger. The concept of a stranger is what? Is when I know that something exists outside of me. I detect its presence, but I do not know anything about it. I do not know how it exists outside of me. All I know is what I see in my mind that tells me the photograph of what that is. That's the maximum amount of knowledge that I can accept in my mind in the Olam Asiyah. Now in the higher world, when I'm spiritual, when people pass away and they become souls, they can see another soul. That's right, they can. But it's not called sight, but it's called a deeper knowledge. Because in the Olam of Ruchnius, which is the world of Yetzirah and Bria and so on, you can actually more than detect another presence. You can actually know something about the other presence. And what you know something about what that is, what the tachlis of that is, what that being, that soul, has to masaken. So suddenly you get new information. How do you get this information? Well, you don't get this information through your senses because there's no senses. In the world of Ruchnius, there's no such thing as seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, touching. No, there's another sense. It's called the ability of one neshama to know another neshama. But the seeing is not an act of seeing. It's not a sense. It's not a sensory act. It's a knowing act. When you, let's say, when one neshama looks at another neshama, it knows who that other neshama is. In other words, what used to be a sight, when that soul was in a body, now becomes an act of knowing. In the physical universe, which is the Olam Asiyah, it's an act of detection. The closest we can get to another being is we detect the presence of something else, but we have no knowledge of it. That's called a stranger. But when one soul is looking at another soul, it knows who that soul is and what it's about, what it has to do. So it knows that soul in terms of its act of tikkun. Where does that knowledge come to it? It comes to it automatically, because the connection between one spiritual entity and another is one of connection. Suddenly, its ability to know another soul, it knows that other soul through a knowledge of itself. The knowledge of another soul is contained within the knowledge of yourself. So therefore, it's a much deeper level of the detection. It's no longer simply detection where you know that something is outside of you. You actually know what that thing is outside of you, and you know what's outside of you is a thing which has a certain job, tikkun. It has a certain tachlis, a certain purpose that has to fix itself in a way, and you understand exactly what that process is. So when a soul sees another soul, it sees knowledge. What is simply a sense on this world, and that's the knowledge at the level of this world, of the physical universe. In the spiritual world, that knowledge becomes a understanding of who that other soul is. Not simply that soul exists. It has more than the knowledge of detection. It has an actual knowledge of knowing who is that other soul. So we see in the world of the spiritual world of Ruchnius, we are suddenly now in touch with the organismic aspect of our relationship. We are not in contact with the organismic aspect of our relationship in the physical world. On the physical world, it looks like that being is completely outside of me. But all I'm doing is detecting it. I don't go any further than a detection. I have no knowledge of the person other than the fact that there exists something outside of me which is producing through my five senses an image in my mind. That's it. All I can do is detect the presence of another thing. But I do not have any knowledge that him and I are organismic, that we are part of the same being. But in the world of Ruchnius, I suddenly have that knowledge. That knowledge is similar to the perception in the spiritual universe. So what is knowledge about the other being is actually the way to sense to the other being in the spiritual world. The sensing of another person is not done through a sensory organ. Like how does one see something? Well, that's through the sensory organ called the eyes. The eyes allow my mind to create an image of that person. So I detect them through my senses. But in the spiritual world, I don't have eyes. But do I have a certain internalized knowledge of that other being automatically because I sense the organismic relationship between us two. So what is knowledge in the spiritual world is only a sense detection in the physical world. And this is very deep. So what I'm saying is I'm defining what is knowledge of another person. Just because you detect them, well, that's not knowledge. Good, you detect another presence. You detect the concept of an outside, but you don't know anything about the outside, and therefore it's called a stranger. But in the spiritual world, you know who that outside is. You know what he's about, what he has to do. How? Well, it's not done to what? It's done because on the spiritual world, you are capable of detecting something which is part of your organism. So that's how you know another organism. You know another Zulasa in the spiritual world because he's another organism. And you know him because you know you. Finally, when you go to a higher world, to the world of what you see and breathe and so on, your knowledge of that person becomes greater and greater. How? It simply is. You simply know what you know. Why? Because you know yourself. And as you know yourself, you are also gaining information about the other person, about the Zulasai. So one Zulasai, therefore, begins to see pieces of another Zulasai, which are much deeper. On the lowest level of physicality, all you can do is detect the existence of something, of a multiplicity, but you cannot know anything about it. But in the spiritual world, you can not only detect, but you can actually know that other being, that other Zulosai. How? Because you know yourself. And on a higher world, you know more about the person and more and more. So finally, when we come all the way up to the highest world again, when we are in Olam Haba, we not only know that there is something outside of us, we not only know what that thing is in terms of its tachlis, what its domain is. We not only know what it has to do, what it has to be masakin, we intimately know how, through our connection. It's the connection between one cell to another cell in an organism that tells me this information. Just like an organ, the heart knows the brain, each of the cells know each other. How? How do they sense it? They sense it they sense in themselves the unity of two Zulosais. And this is critical. Knowledge comes by seeing our unity as an organism. And when I begin to see the fact that we have a relationship called an organism, I begin to have knowledge of what that Zulosai, that other Zulosai is. Finally, in Olam Haba, I have the highest knowledge of another Zulasai. That's right. Because in Olam Haba, I not only know that something is there, I detect it. I not only know who is that person, what does he have to do, what is his tachlis in terms of the tikkun of the total organism. I not only know that, but I know one more thing that I do not know in the lower worlds. I know what my relationship is to that other Zulasoi. That's right. Not only do I know that he exists, not only do I know that he's part of an organism in a certain sense, and I know what he has to do, but at the highest level, I know his relationship to me. So in other words, the yichud that we both possess, the fact that he's not really outside of me, is known in the highest level of existence, which is Olam Haba. That's when I have a knowledge not only that another Zulasa exists, not only, which is no longer a stranger, I know what he has to do. I know the features, the qualities of his being. But at the highest level, I know how those qualities of his being relate to me. How him and I relate to each other in the total organism called the Zulasoi. I have a sense of who that guy is and who I am in the Zulasoi, the macro Zulasoi, the total Zulasoi. And that knowledge becomes so serious that it's almost like I'm looking at myself. Why is it like I'm looking at myself? Because at the highest level of knowledge of another person, which is an Olam Haba, it's like I'm looking at myself. Why? Because I'm looking at myself through him. And I'm looking at him through me. In other words, I'm looking at both of us through what we share in common, which is the ultimate Zulasai. So we see, therefore, the way that knowledge is grasped. It goes from the Olam Asir, which is the lowest level, where there is the most highest level of separation. All I can do is merely detect the presence of another being, of another Zulasai. I can only detect that there is something outside of me, but I have no idea really what that is really. I just have a bunch of photographs in my mind of it. So that's the lowest level, and therefore I am furthest away from seeing myself as an organism. But then when I become spiritual and I'm a soul, I can sense what this other person is. I have knowledge of not only detecting his presence, but knowing who he is. And that means I know something about his tikkun, what he has to do. And at the highest levels of spirituality, which is the Olam Haba, I not only know I not only detect his presence, and I not only know that he is, but I know his relationship to me, which means that what I am now detecting is not the individual aspect of our Zulasoi, but I am detecting what's called the macro Zulasoi, the total Zulasoi, and all its parts. I see myself as part of the total Zulasoi, and I see him as part. Please, there's a noise. There's a noise coming from someone on the phone. Because in Olam Haba, I not only see myself, I not only have a knowledge of the other person, but I also have a knowledge of both of us in terms of the totality of who we are, and that's called the macro Zulasoi. I see not only the foreground, where I see him and me, but I see us. I have the knowledge of us, of we. And what is the knowledge of we? The knowledge of we, or us, is a knowledge of the plurality of all Zulasois as they fit together in terms of a macro Zulasoi, the total Zulasoi. The total Zulasoi is composed of all the individual Zulasois as a superorganism, as almost being like each other. And I have that knowledge finally. So we see that the way I know another person changes with whichever plane of existence I am. Just like when God made the Stalshlus, when he made one world lower than the next world, lower than the next world. As he went down through the worlds, it became darker and darker. What became darker? The knowledge that I am part of an organism. That's what gets darker and darker. So the further down I go, the greater the knowledge of myself. And so, or I should say, the greater the possibility of seeing a multiplicity, that we're all separate. So that if I be at the physical level, I see someone else as so separate from me, he's a stranger. But as I go back up, as I go back up in the spiritual and finally to the level of eternally, nitzchias, he said, I suddenly have a knowledge of what? One, that I can detect his presence. Two, that I know who he is. I know who the other Zulus is and what his tachlis is in what? In the organism. And finally, I see him in the tachlis of a superorganism. I can see him and me as part of one super being called the Zulusai. And when I have that level of comprehension, which is astounding, then I begin to have the knowledge of who I am, who I belong to, who am I a part of. And I see the totality of the existence of the Zulusai as an entity, and suddenly I comprehend God. Because I say to myself, what? Is this my relationship with everyone else? In other words, I'm not separate from everyone else. I'm part of everyone else. And finally, I get to such a knowledge where when I'm looking at another person, it's almost like I'm looking at me, because I understand the relationship that other Zulusai has with me. So that's when I begin to realize God. God is a being who is completely beyond knowledge. There is absolutely no outside to God. As if it's impossible for us to even know it. We do not have a frame of reference to look at God. But that's when I realized that frame of reference is completely the absence of an outside. And I suddenly begin to understand who God is. So what I'm describing in this year is that the progressive forms of how I know things. How do I know something in the physical world? How do I know something in the spiritual world? And finally, how do I know something in the eternal world beyond time and space? Now, one more thing. When Adam sinned, he developed a new world that didn't exist before. And what was that world called? That was called the world of Zorma. Now, most people don't know what Zorma is. The word Zorma means impurity, contamination. So when Adam did a sin, the first man, Adam Rishon, before the sin, the world was clean. It was not composed of any concept of impurity. There was no tumor. All you did was the absence of a concept of a unity of an organism. When you go from the highest world to the lowest world, what you're losing is the concept of the unity of the world. You're losing the concept of unity, of organismic unity. That's what you lose. But that's not in itself impure. That's not contamination. But when you do a sin, suddenly a contamination comes on your ability to know something. It's now contaminated. How? And I'll tell you exactly how. Because when you live in the world of Zorma, which is the world of great chosek, darkness, what did you do? What did you do when you suddenly did a sin? You unplugged from God, and God took what you should have been annihilated because you defied God and unplugged from Him. So you should have been annihilated because He takes away His existence. Instead, He lets you live, but He lets you live in a state of darkness. But what is that darkness? What is the difference between the darkness in which we see people in the physical universe? What is that difference? And we see everyone as a stranger. And what is that darkness in the world of Zorma? Could Zorma be higher than seeing another person as a stranger? The greatest darkness is when we see another Zulusai and we see him as a total stranger. So all we can do is detect his presence. We cannot know anything about him. In order to know something about him, we have to go up to a higher plane of spirituality. So then suddenly I begin to see the shadow of an organism. And in Olam Haba, I see the complete unity of the organism. Okay. But what happens if I go down? What happens when I do a sin and I'm in the greatest form of darkness? What is the greatest form of darkness? How does it manifest itself? It manifests itself, why? How? Because when you look at another Zulusai, you're not looking at a stranger. You are looking at it as an enemy, as an adversary. That's right. In the world of Zorma, every other zulasa becomes an adversary, becomes an enemy. That is the darkness of Zoyama. The darkness of Geshem, the darkness of physicality is what? That you do not see the unity between you and another one. You do not see any sense of an organism. That's the darkness of physicality in the physical world. But if you sin and you defy God, suddenly perception is not a stranger. You're not looking at a stranger. You are now looking at an enemy, as an adversary. When you're in competition with someone who's against you, who wants to destroy you in the competitive act. So the world of Zohar produces a new concept that I never had before. Before, when I was just simply a physical person, but I never sinned, I have the concept of another person as what? I have the concept of another person as a stranger. That's it. And when I go higher, I have the concept that he's an organism, and then finally a superorganism. But what's the concept that I have of another person in the world of Zoma? What does Zoma introduce in its impurity? It's in its contamination that is a new level of darkness. And that is when I look at another person, I see a competitor, I see an enemy, I see an adversary. And what's called an anti-organism. An organism is something, is an entity where each of the separate components work together as a team towards the same goal. That's an organism. And I cannot see the concept of organism in the physical universe. Everything appears as outside of me, as a stranger. But what happens when I sin and I introduce a new level of darkness where suddenly I see this other person not as simply someone outside of me and so on, and who I merely detect, but I see this person as a danger to me, as a threat. I see him as an enemy. So then suddenly what appears is the world of predators. What is a predator? A predator is someone who does not look at someone as an outside being, but he sees that person in terms of his own needs. And the main need of a predator is to eat. To eat. So therefore, one animal eats another animal. Now that's a hellish activity. Why does one animal have to eat another animal? Why do we have to eat plants? What's going on here? Why do we have to absorb another entity, plants, animals, and so on, inside of ourselves to exist? In other words, why do we see every other entity as our food supply? That's what happens. In the world of Zoma, we see every other being outside of us as part of our food supply. And what kind of punishment is that? Before I saw him when a lion looks at when he looks at a zebra before the sin, he didn't see his food supply. He wasn't a predator. He wasn't a carnivore. He didn't eat other animals. In other words, before the sin, there was no such thing as predation. Nothing ate another being. They coexisted. But after the sin of Adam, there was created the concept of a predator, where another being became the food supply of the other being. So this is the worst type of relationship you can have with something outside of you, where it's your enemy. Or actually, it's your food supply. You have to eat it for you to survive. And that's the concept of predation. Why? Because Zoma is the ultimate predator. Zoma has to feed on your soul by virtue of the sin that you did. When you do a sin, you bring a certain contamination into your soul. And then the Zoma eats from that Kedusha that you have in your soul. When you do a sin, you give the entitlement of another type of spiritual entity to actually use you as food, and that in the Kabbalah is called Yanika. To be Yonik is to nourish from, is to nurse, to feed on something else. And the concept of feeding on something else is the concept of a predator, of predation. And therefore that is an activity which takes place only with entities which are created in the world of Zoma. So therefore we see in the world of Zoma, which was created after the sin, was a new type of relationship between each other. when we do not see simply each other as an organism. We don't even see each other as strangers, because you can be strangers and still be peaceful with each other. But we see each other as enemies, to use each other as we wish, to use each other for the purpose of continuing to exist. That's the relationship which exists in the world of Zorma, predation. So look at what I'm saying. In order for God to tell us about himself, that I cannot be known because I have no outside, he had to create worlds which begin to distance us from ourselves, from the Zolosoi. The Zolosoi is suddenly broken up from a superorganism to a position when he can't even, all he knows is to detect the presence of something, but he doesn't know who it is. So you go from what? A superorganism down to an organism, down to the concept of no organism, where you're strangers. All that exists in the world to produce the idea of an outside, so that you would mistakenly think that God is outside of you. And God wants you to correct that and annihilate that concept that you're not outside of God. So that's why he called what's called a Shtalshelus, one world to another, where each world that descends now has a darker place, because you used to see each other as a superorganism, and then you went to a darker place, and now you see yourself as just an organism, and a darker place where you see each other as strangers. So your relation with each other is now being changed. But if you commit a sin, so suddenly the entire picture changes. When now another being, another Zurosoi, is not simply what? A non-organism. It's not simply a stranger. It's an anti-organism. It's your enemy. It's your adversary. It competes with you. It threatens you with the concept of predation. That's where a predator comes from. That's why when Yeshaya says, and the wolf shall lie down with the lamb, that in the time when comes the time in the Yemotzi Mashiach, when the Mashiach comes and brings the Gula, predation will disappear. There will be no longer any predators in the world. Why? Because no animal will feel like the other animal is its food supply. That concept will no longer exist. So we see how far we are away from God. That not only do we see God as a you outside of us, but we begin to see each other as a you. First, a you as an organism, then you as a non-organism, where someone else is a stranger. Then finally, in the world of Zorma, after I sin, you see another you as what? As an enemy of yours, which has to be destroyed through predation. So we notice that our ability to relate is continuously becoming less and less. It's continuously decreasing. So that under the rule of Zorma, under the world of Zorma, under the contamination and impurity of Zorma, we are now enemies. And that's what it's about. So now you understand the most important principle of all. God teaches us that he is not a you. It's not a me-you relationship, because that would instigate his yichud pressure to annihilate you. But you have to learn that the hard way. So God does that by creating different realities, which continuously covers up your real relationship of a superorganism. And finally, you get a relationship, what? Where you're a stranger. And that's where you start from. But when you sin, you go even further down. You're not only do you not have the relationship of an organism, so you have a non-organismic relationship. In the physical universe, we all feel to each other as strangers, unless we're relatives or friends. But we don't have any concept that I'm part of an organism with you. We have no such concept. You are a stranger, which means that you now exist in a non-organismic relationship. That's right. But when we sin, we go down one step further than the physical. We are beyond the physical, because now I see another person, not simply as what? As a non-organism, or he's a stranger. I see him as an enemy that has to be destroyed. And that's what a sin does. It changes the view that I have of the Zolose itself. The Zolose, the knowledge of the Zolose changed from a non-organismic stranger to an enemy. That's the wages of sin. That's the consequences of a sin. And when the Mashiach comes, he will remove that lowest level called Zohar. He will remove death and the concept of never again seeing non-organism relationships. When the world becomes spiritual again, to Zichar Aguf, and so on, we will redevelop the insight that all of us are related to each other. We are connected. We will all have knowledge of each other as part of the Makos Urasoi. And finally, in Olam Haba, which is the ultimate place where we become one again. We become so close to each other that it seems to be that when we look at another Zulasoi, we're almost looking at ourselves. That's how close we will become. We will be called a superorganism, where every person will almost equal every other person, because that's who God is. But God is not an organism at all. God is beyond an organism, because God has nothing to do with an outside. So I'm trying to paint a picture that we will eventually come to the knowledge of who God is by obtaining the knowledge of who we are. That we are not separate entities, completely divorced from each other. No, we are an organism. And in Olam Haba, we will become a superorganism. And that's knowledge. When you have no knowledge of someone else, that person is called a stranger. When you have knowledge of someone else, that person is called an organism. And when you have the total knowledge of someone else, where you not only know who you are and who he is, but who you are together in the organism, you are a superorganism. So we have descended from the highest level of being to the lowest level of being, where we always see each other as strangers and even enemies. And when the Mashiach comes, who will remove the insight of Zohar, we will finally begin to see who we really are to each other. And we will not hate each other. We will love each other. There will develop a love between one Zulasai and the other Zulasai. That's why the Torah says, that you should love your neighbor yourself. Why? Because he is almost yourself. He is Kamocha. Why do you have to love another person? Because he is almost you. The word Kamocha tells me the reason why love is possible between two people. Because you are almost one person. So this is the entire mechanism, dynamic of all the physical and the spiritual universe and Olam Haba, the eternal universe. There are three universes. The eternal universe that has no time and space, the spiritual universe that is known to souls, and souls are, like I say, are certain lenses which gives me a knowledge that my relationship to someone else is an organism. And finally, when it appears that there is no organism, that's the physical universe. But also, even when there's Zohar, there's an anti-organismic universe. So this is what it is. And we go down to reality, and finally we go back up to reality. And it all proceeds to teach us one concept. And what's that concept? What is the ultimate lesson that I have to learn by me going through all of these worlds, one after the other, down to the lowest level of perception of who another Zulasoi, to the highest level of perception where I see another Zulasoi as a superorganism? What? It's the knowledge of who God is. God says, I am not like you. I am not an organism with anything. I am absolutely alone, individuated, independent. I am beyond the concept of outside. There is nothing outside of me. And the way you will learn that is when you learn your own relationship with each other. You will learn who you are, and then you will know who I am. Okay, that's it. Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Just based on the last statement you made, that is why God did it, so that we would learn from our relationship with each other who God is. But Kodem HaChet,
Right.
We didn't have that issue. There was only one Zulaso. There weren't multiplicity of Zulaso. And wasn't that, so this was only like a b'diavad position, but l'chadchila, this was not supposed to happen.
Actually, I don't understand what you're saying. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, that you just summed it all up and said that that Hashem created this frame of reference from one zulaso to another, in order that we should then be able to learn who God. Okay, that was the theme of today's shir.
Right.
But Kodem Achet, when Adam Harishon there was just one zulaso. There was no multiplicity of zulasos for one to have a frame of reference to each other. So that concept didn't exist.
No, because Kodem, the Chet of the Zolosoi, Adam Rishon was only one person. Every soul was connected to each other inside. But the Namlik Sufa that existed then, the problem was between him and God, not between him and another person.
Right. No, but
so God said,
Stalshless and all that was created. Wasn't that created even then? The Stalshless existed.
No. In Adam Rishon before the sin, there was no issue of him to himself and him to other people, because there was no other people. There was only him and his wife. So Namlik Sufa did not exist between man and man, because the individuation of mankind, each person from another, only appeared after the sin. Before the sin, humans are sensitive to each other.
Got it. But
I
understand that. What I'm saying is that the idea that God created the man-to-man situation so that we would understand the man-to-God situation better. But my point is that the man-to-man situation did not exist before the sin, and therefore that wasn't Hashem's original plan.
But in a way, in other words, the Namlik Sufa, the problem of multiplicity, did exist between man and God. That's how it started. But in a way, by the Chet of Adoration, he was commanded to do something by God. So the conflict lay with God. And that's what he was supposed to fix. That's true. It was not with other men. But after the sin, it descended to all other people and so on. But the Namlik Sufa appears in stages. It first appears originally with God. That's the main issue. But then, if you don't correct that, it then suddenly reappears as a new issue between man and man. So what I'm saying, you see, I agree with you. I'll modify that slightly. But it's not that it's still a problem outside. The one problem that God has with the Zulosoi is that the Zulosoi keeps on seeing the concept of outside. God is a you. And it first starts with God, and then later on it descends to mankind. So that's true. So in that
my
sense.
point was
so what
the man-to-man idea was that
what I meant was I meant really after the sin becomes an extended version of Namlik Sufa. It's altered slightly. But I did not mention, to be more exact, that initially it started out man to God. So what I'm saying is that you are correct in that way. Initially it was man to God, and then it became man to man. But it essentially is the same problem. And that's why I mentioned, because the problem is what? The problem is the concept of outside, period.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Yes, agreed.
Yes, any other questions? Okay, very good. I hope you enjoyed it.
First of all, I want to say I was fascinated by the concept of food. With
what's that?
Moving from the concept of food and how you can trace the history of the eating patterns of, like, after the flood we can eat animals, and after the sin animals ate each other, and so now here's a question for you. And in Olam Haba there is no eating, which is great. So, and in the desert we ate the mun. All this amazing thing, you could make a whole share about that. But I was wondering, what in Gan Eden, Adam was supposed to eat fruit. So how does that fit in there? Wasn't he a predator on the fruit?
Well, No. Look, souls don't eat at all. There's no feeding of a soul. They absorb the light from God. They don't eat in a sense. So in actuality, the Zulose exists in a state where no eating takes place. There's absorption of the light of God. So in that sense, but in the physical universe, the concept of eating was created, and the eating of a plant does not qualify as predation. That's what you see, because you're allowed to eat plants. Predation starts between animal and animal, not between animal and plant. So I'm going to modify that. The predation exists between man and an animal, or animal and animal.
Why?
Because it seems to take the outside. It's an exaggeration of the concept of outside. At first, an outside is another form of an entity. But then the worst concept of all is when the outside becomes your food supply. That's predation. It was never meant that the outside should become your food supply. All you have to do is distinguish between you and an outside. That was the task of Adam Rishon before the sin. He had to realize that God was his outside, and he had to stop calling God a you. He had to understand that God himself does not have an outside. But after a while, when he sinned, he created the concept of outside, not only as there's an outside, but there exists the concept of predation, where the outside is now become a certain way your adversary, and it sees you as food supply. But it's just an increase in the concept of outside. It's the word outside is changing from a neutral force to an adversarial relationship. So when you sin, you are changing the nature of outside. So
why
the outside
is that threshold?
Well, that has to be that I have to think about. But the plant has a kind of a life cycle where it does not respond to the concept of predation. You wouldn't call a plant. Well, there is a certain thing of plants. Some plants eat other plants. So you have the concept of predation with plants too. For example, like the Venus fly trap. I think that plant eats insects. So this wasn't meant to be. And I doubt if the Venus flytrap or even ate bugs. In other words, the concept of predation is a concept which derives from Zohar. It's not a natural thing for one thing to eat another thing and so on, to cause it to die and then to eat it. That is completely unnatural. And that's only the result of a sin. That's when the concept of outside has completely descended to its lowest form. So in another sense, we see that as true. But that has to be examined more. But the general concept is what I said. First of all, there's a concept where something is an organism. And then there's finally a concept where something is a non-organism, strangers. But then finally, when Zohar appears, there's a concept that not only a concept of non-organism, but an anti-organism, where the thing is your enemy. So we see the continuous de-evolution of the concept of outside. Okay. So
Shimon,
yes.
Adam Rishon Koydem Achet. I guess the fruits in Gan Eden were not a predatory act. I guess that was part of his actual organism. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Koydem Achet. Adam ate plants. For some reason, that's not. When you eat a plant, even though a plant has a form of life, it's not considered predation. It's only considered predation when you eat another animal. Now, today exactly why and not. I don't know if I can tell you that exactly now, but somehow the Torah is not considered predation.
It's a very interesting concept. No, I understand. I just wanted to make sure I heard you clearly. You're saying that it was a denigration in the self, which this concept of predatory eating. But
one of the main ideas that I wanted to say is this concept of what is God trying to do? He's trying to tell you, I'm not an outside. You're not outside of me. And the way he tells you that is by creating the condition of outside, where suddenly you begin to do what he says, the commandments, and then you begin to love him. So therefore you rectify that concept of an outside. You cannot eliminate it. When we see God, we see him always as a you. That's built in. You know what I mean? There's something which is as a source of consciousness that comes from him. But God says, but you have to eliminate this belief that I'm outside and that I have an outside. So first I will put you in a situation where that's what you see. And gradually, by keeping the commandment and loving me, it will disappear. That was the original intention of the whole Ishtalshelus. I'm trying to give you the nimshul of what the Ishtalshelus is. That when we go from one world to another, we are descending in our appreciation of what is outside. It's getting worse and worse and worse. And we have to negate it and rise up. So the purpose of descent, that the world descended to a higher degree of multiplicity and therefore an outside, has to disappear by gradually our rejection of that concept. So we have to go down in order to go up. And the highest level that we reach relative to this is the Olam Haba, the future world, where we will all feel to each other in a way like we're almost part of each other. And that will stay the concept of yichud pressure, so that we will continue to exist without time or space or any activity. We have earned our ability to exist by preventing the one possibility which will annihilate us.